ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Labor and the opposition are in furious agreement. They want to stop the decline in the number of GPs bulk billing. But what was behind the fall in the first place? And can $8.5 billion fix it? Today, health economist Stephen Duckett on how it really could mean you won't need your credit card for a visit to your GP. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily.
Any day now you will receive this envelope. Inside is your Medicare enrolment form and a brochure explaining how Medicare will provide every permanent resident with basic health insurance.
Stephen, in early 1984, Medicare was born under the then Prime Minister Bob Hawke.
Then every Australian, from newborn babe to Prime Minister, can share in the cheapest, simplest and fairest health insurance scheme Australia's ever had.
Medicare.
It was quite a moment, wasn't it?
Oh, yes, quite extraordinary. Medibank had been introduced by Gough Whitlam, but despite a promise to, inverted commas, maintain Medibank, it was demolished over the next 8 or 9 years by the then Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser and the coalition government. And a key promise in that 83 election was to reintroduce Medicare, which they did on the 1st of February.
Yeah, okay. And the idea was that you would not need a bank card to see a doctor. You just need a Medicare card.
Exactly. So it was all about access to healthcare. It was all about getting rid of financial barriers. It was all about ensuring that all Australians could see a doctor when they needed to.
Right, and that was bulk billing. So back then, was everyone bulk billed?
Everybody was eligible for bulk billing. The take-up of bulk billing was low initially, but it grew steadily over the course of the Hawke government and was up in the 80s and 90s in, I think 5 or 7 years after the introduction of Medicare.
Can you just explain the term bulk billing? Because it is a kind of strange terminology.
Back in the day when Medibank was introduced, Australians didn't have credit cards. There were no computers. If you went to a GP and they had decided that you weren't going to have an out-of-pocket, they had these little slips and they'd bundle them up in bulk and post them off to what was Medibank, and they'd get paid. So rather than in each individual being paid, the idea was the government would pay them in response to these bulk, little slips being sent in bulk. And that's where the term bulk billing came from.
Fascinating. I never knew that. So when did we start to see a decline?
There were sort of 2 phases in the decline of bulk billing. One in the early 2000s. The then government was playing around with indexation rates and bulk billing dropped a lot. And then prior to the election in 2013, I think it was, the Liberal Party, the Coalition Party, promised that there'd be no cuts to healthcare and so on. But in the very first budget, the 2014 budget, they took an axe and massive cuts to health, including a proposal to introduce a compulsory co-payment for everybody seeing a GP. This did not survive the Senate.
It's taken 10 painful months to get from the budget's Plan A,
from the introduction of a $7 Medicare co-contribution,
through December's Plan B reboot,
of doctors charging, at their discretion, a $5 co-payment,
to the full retreat of Plan C.
The proposal for an optional $5 co-payment does not have broad support.
The co-payment is dead, buried and cremated.
And so rather than doing a compulsory co-payment as an explicit, overt policy, they did a co-payment by stealth. They did not index the Medicare rebate, no indexation for inflation, and so the doctors were squeezed. That is, costs were going up, but the rebate wasn't. So slowly over time, more doctors began to say, oh, I can't afford this anymore. And so bulk billing rates began to decline.
So a freeze on GP rebates, meaning they weren't being adjusted in relation to inflation, it sort of forced the hand of doctors across the country, did it? In essence, they had to start charging this so-called co-payment because they just couldn't afford to work otherwise.
Their income was going down because their costs were going up and their revenue wasn't going up. So the GPs' incomes were squeezed.
So, Stephen, what did that then do to the bulk billing rates?
So the bulk billing rates began to go down. So they were up in the 90s and they just slowly, well, some said free fall, went down from the 90s down to the 80s, down to the high 70s. So quite a significant reduction in the proportion of attendances, that is GP visits, that were bulk billed. And the number of people, the proportion of people that had all of their GP interactions bulk billed went down from the high 60s down to the high 40s. So fewer than half the population were now being bulk billed for all of their care.
So where are bulk billing numbers the lowest in Australia at this point?
Well, the ACT, I think, has the lowest proportion of people who are always bulk billed in the low 20s. In lower income areas of the country, they're much higher than that, into the 80s. But still, it's a bit of a lottery. If you go to a doctor, you don't know whether you're going to be bulk billed or not.
And if you are having to make a co-payment, what's that sitting at around?
Roughly in the high 40s, around $50. So it's really quite a significant payment you might have to make.
It's a decision for people, isn't it? Whether they can afford to make that payment.
Exactly. And as I said, in the context of everything, all the cost of living pressures, you want to be able to make sure you can always get to see a GP if you need to.
So, Stephen, let's look now at this pledge from the government and the opposition, of course, to boost bulk billing.
Today I announce that our government will expand the bulk billing incentive to cover all Australians. This is the biggest boost to Medicare in its history.
Labor is promising that by 2030, 90% of GP visits will be bulk billed, and within minutes it was matched by the opposition.
Today we will match dollar for dollar the announcements that have been made by the government. We will do that because Australians deserve the quality health care that they have been successively denied over the last 3 years.
It now has bipartisan support, which really makes it a non-election issue, if you like.
Yeah, possibly. The government announced on Sunday that they would introduce the biggest investment of money in Medicare since it was started to try and increase the rate of bulk billing. And so what they've done is, early in their term, they tripled the bulk billing incentive to try and increase the rate of bulk billing, and it did, but it still left it too low in parts of, especially metropolitan Australia. And so the Sunday initiative was both to increase what's called the bulk billing incentive, made that much bigger, and then they said on top of that, if your whole practice bulk bills, that is, if people know that if they front up to your practice you're going to bulk bill them, then there'd be an additional incentive on top, sort of a 12.5% bonus for bulk billing. And so that, I suspect, in fact I'm pretty sure, will lead to many more practices going into 100% bulk billing, and will increase the overall rate of bulk billing from where it is now in the high 70s up to 90%, I think.
All right, so it's an $8.5 billion commitment. So that is what, the government paying GP practices if they bulk bill?
Yeah, so some of it is just paid through the fee-for-service payment arrangements with a bulk billing incentive associated with each GP item number, and the other is a practice payment, so to say to the practice owners, if all of your practice bulk bills will give you this 12.5% bonus.
Right, okay, so that means that there's a much bigger incentive for GPs across the country to bulk bill. This would be an end to the decline of bulk billing, you think?
Absolutely. I think it will lead to an uptick. And if you're a practice which is already billing at 85 or 90%, then in a sense it's money for jam. If your practice is only billing at 50%, you might go up to 60%. But as I said, it's the ones that are billing a significant proportion of their patients right now. They'll say, yeah, 100%, we can go to 100% and get that extra 12.5% bonus.
Right, but hang on, so does that mean the end of the co-payment? So if you went to a doctor, you would not pay anything?
For those practices which are 100% bulk billing, indeed it means that.
Okay, and how many do you think would actually go to that level, 100%?
I think a significant number of practices will, because they just have to do the arithmetic. If they're already bulk billing 80% or 85%, the arithmetic suggests that you'll get an extra 12.5% for just going up to 100%.
What about in a place like the ACT where there's barely any bulk billing?
Yeah, I think you might see a little bit of an uptick in the ACT. As I said, currently it's around 23-ish%, I think. You might get it up to 30%, but I don't think you'll hit the 90% in the ACT. I just think the doctors there have had their own way of doing things for quite a long time.
Right.
And unless there's a massive increase in the number of GPs or nurse practitioners, there'll be low rates for quite a while.
What about in places like, in the centre of Sydney or the centre of Melbourne, where it's pretty hard to find a doctor that bulk bills at this point?
It is a matter of looking around. As I said, at the moment, about 70% of all attendances are bulk billed. So, the gossip is you can't find a GP, but that's often the gossip from people who are wealthy, people who are on pensioners and healthcare card holding are already being bulk billed. So it is a matter of getting that 70% up to 90%, and I think that's feasible.
Well, Stephen, with bipartisan support, it doesn't sound like much can get in the way of this becoming a reality, or could it?
Yeah, I'm a bit nervous about saying it's all a done deal, because we do know that back in 75, Malcolm Fraser promised they'd maintain Medibank, and they didn't. We do know back in 2013, Tony Abbott promised no cuts to healthcare, and that wasn't the case. So there have been promises in the past that haven't been fulfilled. But at the moment, you just have to say this is a work in progress.
All right. But if it does become a reality then, how quickly will this whole system change? How quickly would we be at 90%?
So the government says it will start on the 1st of November this year. So the money starts to flow this year. Whether practices adjust the next day is, of course, a matter. Each practice will make their own decision. In the big states, payroll tax is not paid if the attendance is bulk billed, so that is a further incentive. So I think, I'm pretty confident that we'll see it quite quickly. The government said in its modelling it's going to be 2030. I think that's probably a bit slow. I think things will change more quickly than that.
All right. Well, Stephen, what practically does this mean if it goes ahead for the health of the nation? How important is it?
Obviously, we want to make sure that people who need to see a GP can see a GP, because sometimes it's a matter of catching something early before it gets much worse. And so making sure there are no financial barriers to access is really, really important. This, however, is not the only reform that's needed in general practice. We need to update the whole way we fund general practice, the whole way general practice works, so it's more multidisciplinary and so on. So this is really, really important, don't get me wrong, but it's not the only thing that needs to happen.
Stephen Duckett is an honorary professor at the University of Melbourne. This episode was produced by Sydney Peat and Cara Jensen-McKinnon. Audio production by Adair Shepherd. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. Thanks for listening.